class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 2 of the Sharks Rookie Faceoff tournament, in which the Sharks took on the Vegas Golden Knights and won by a score of 5-1. And before we jump into how each specific player actually performed in tonight's game, there are a couple of notes that I want to make about the lineup. The first of which will be about the lineup in general for the tournament as a whole, and the second of which will be more specifically about the lineup here tonight. And so the first is for those who may have been following the news around the league about other teams' rookie face-off tournaments. You likely will have heard by now that the first overall pick from this past year's draft, Connor Bedard, scored a hat trick in his first game with the Chicago Blackhawks, and the third overall pick from this past year's draft, Adam Fantilli, scored a hat trick in his first game with the Columbus Blue Jackets. So some Sharks fans may be wondering where the Sharks' fourth overall pick in this past year's draft, Will Smith, is and why he has not played in either of these first two games. Well, that's because he's not actually on the roster for this tournament, and there is no mysterious or nefarious reason for why that is. It's not as though the Sharks didn't want him here, and it's not as though Will Smith didn't want to be here, but more specifically that Will Smith committed to play another year in college, another year in the NCAA, and so technically, while he is within the Sharks umbrella, within the Sharks organization, he's not actually signed, and so he cannot really be here at this tournament. This is not an unprecedented situation for the San Jose Sharks. They've had many players in the past, one of which is on the roster currently for the San Jose Sharks, Mario Ferraro, who committed to playing in Boston University and so not immediately signed by the San Jose Sharks. So this is not to say that Will Smith is going to be the type of player who's going to hold out 3 years and then just become an unrestricted free agent, kind of like what Henry Thrun did with the Anaheim Ducks. Just the reasoning for why he is not here, and to not really worry about it, but something that I wanted to mention yesterday but forgot to, so I thought I would bring it up in today's video. The following lineup comment is about specifically tonight's game, which John McCarthy confirmed. As you'll notice, a few of the familiar faces here like Eklund and Robbins and Thrun are not in the lineup. This is not because McCarthy thought that they played poorly here tonight, but more specifically because he wanted to give an opportunity to some of the tryout and NHL signed players to get a game here in this rookie face-off tournament. This is primarily because not only is this tournament for seeing how some of these Sharks' actual top prospects will perform, where they've landed on the depth charts, how their development is coming after a multiple month off season, but it's also an opportunity to see how some of the more destined to be AHL players will actually perform going into next season, because this is one of the main priorities that has been there for Mike Grier ever since being signed on to the organization as general manager. Not only has he wanted to improve the San Jose Sharks, but he's also wanted to improve their minor league squad, the San Jose Barracuda, because for many, many years, even prior to the San Jose Barracuda being called the San Jose Barracuda, back to when they were the Worcester Sharks, they've never really been a good AHL team. And that was pretty understandable back when the Sharks were an extremely dominant franchise, because they would constantly siphon the talent out of the AHL, and they wouldn't really replace it with anybody because they'd frequently be trading their first round picks, and so the AHL team was kind of just left to rot a bit. But ever since the Sharks have been really bad over these past few years, the Barracuda have been no better, and in fact have at times even been worse than the San Jose Sharks. So this is probably not very good for a team that's looking to rebuild. They want to try and help that pipeline that will bring talent up to the main organization, and so that starts with trying to get them onto a winning culture, and that starts with bringing in players who may not exactly factor into the future for the San Jose Sharks, but can help the AHL team in the short term. And so you'll notice a lot of unfamiliar names on the roster for tonight's game. But let's start off with the familiar names who are playing their second straight game here tonight. That is the entirety of the top six for the San Jose Sharks. And immediately we have, of course, Thomas Bordeleau. With Eklund out of the lineup, with Thrun out of the lineup, he is the closest to NHL-ready player who actually dressed in tonight's game for the San Jose Sharks, and it was definitely on full display here tonight. An extremely skilled game from Thomas Bordeleau. It wasn't filled to the brim, all positives, I would say. There were still a couple of suspect moments where there was just some pretty unreliable plays, and if there's one thing that a coach absolutely loves out of their younger players is when they can bring that certain level of reliability where the coach knows that whenever they send them over the boards that they're going to be making the smarter play more often than not. And that was a bit of an issue here tonight for Bordeleau, who was constantly looking for those plays, which means that it occasionally led to some awkward passes, some direct passes to the opposing team. But on the positive side of things, Bordeleau was just absolutely dominant, clearly the most skilled player for the Sharks tonight. Honestly, the most skilled player on the ice for both teams here tonight, I would say as well. He scores 2 goals, the first of which a nice tip, the second of which was just a beautiful sort of stick handling move from the ice. He wasn't even on his 2 skates, he was on the ice and yet still managed to get this puck in with a really nice shot. And then the assist was also there on the Ozzy Weisblatt goal, which is the 5th goal of this game. And while this assist might not look super impressive, it didn't go through like 5 different players, it was still a beautiful no-look pass to Weisblatt that completely fooled the Golden Knights goaltender. So just generally a 3-point amazing performance for Bordeleau. It might not be at the hat-trick level of the aforementioned Connor Bedard and Adam Fantilli, but still great game for Bordeleau for sure. And he was joined by a couple of wingers also getting their second straight game, Weisblatt and Brandon Coe. Both of them were on the third line in yesterday's game, now getting bumped up to the first line. Weisblatt, I thought in particular, actually definitely improved from yesterday's game, definitely continued to show off his nice speed, but also showed off a certain level of skill and actually had some pretty decent chemistry, or at least relative to what you would expect from many of these younger players in this rookie face-off tournament. Was pretty good along the boards, continued to show his physicality, solid on the forecheck as well, and complemented Bordeleau very, very well. On the other hand, the sort of black sheep of this third line was Brandon Coe, who, you know, his second period was pretty decent, his first period not so great, but it was just generally a kind of muted performance for Brandon Coe, which is obviously not that great of a thing. I remember a couple of years ago, the 3 prospects with some hype coming out of the junior leagues for the San Jose Sharks were Tristan Robbins, Danil Gushchin, and Brandon Coe. And both Gushchin and Robbins have since played NHL games, only a couple, but still, they've played NHL games with the San Jose Sharks. Coe has not, and honestly, seeing his performance this game and in yesterday's game, I don't think he's particularly close to getting NHL games either, so slightly disappointing there for sure. When it comes to the second line, this time it was Marek being flanked by both Musty and Haltunen. So Haltunen drops from the first line, eventually playing with Eklund yesterday, down to the second line. Musty remains in the same exact spot, and Marek gets boosted up from the third to the second line. Marek was the most impressive player on the third line for the San Jose Sharks yesterday, though that wasn't really saying much from a line that was otherwise not all that amazing. Here tonight, really didn't notice him much, and so not really too much to say. When it comes to Haltunen, you could definitely, like my major comment about him yesterday was that he came as advertised. He had a very good shot, and that was really the major thing that many people pointed out about Haltunen. And it seems as though in the over 24 hours since yesterday's game, there has been some conversations between him and the coaching staff, because while we still saw his shot on display, for instance, I believe it was back in the first period, we saw an offensive zone faceoff where the Sharks won. They immediately win it to Haltunen, who takes a quick shot on net. So that play pretty much lasted about half a second. That is something that you usually only see from players who are sort of pure goal scorer types, but there was still a sort of attempt at branching out, attempt at diversifying his style of play here tonight. There were a couple of moments where he was indeed looking to make that pass, even though he was in a decent enough shooting position where you would expected him to take that shot. So that was definitely nice to see. A pretty good game, all things considered, for Haltunen. On the other side was Quentin Musty, who I thought was sneaky good in yesterday's game. Here tonight, it was definitely a bit more sneaky. I don't think it was as great of a performance, as he was definitely a bit more muted, but still relatively solid. Had a couple of decent plays, and for an 18-year-old player, like I mentioned yesterday, one of the youngest at the rookie face-off tournament for the San Jose Sharks, all things considered, it was pretty good, and we'll see if he manages to get that third game of the tournament, the third and final game of the tournament, how he will look in that one. Once we move on to the third line, we start to get into some of those tryout types of players. First is Russell, who did play in yesterday's game. Not technically a tryout player for sure. He was the fourth line center yesterday. Not super noticeable then. Honestly, still not super noticeable here tonight either. He was flanked by Ethan Cardwell, who I had pointed out as a sort of up and down player yesterday. Cardwell, just in general, I like as a player. He strikes me as an extremely hard worker, and I know that is the ultimate cliche when it comes to NHL players. Pretty much if you ask any NHL coach what they think about a specific player who isn't like a point per game scorer, they'll say, well, he's a hard worker. But it's not a sort of compliment that I give lightly to a player. Obviously, all NHL players will work hard, but there's certain players who can kind of reach that next level of effort, and I think Cardwell is one of them. He gets a goal here tonight, which wasn't necessarily the most beautiful of goals, and it was probably one that the Golden Knights goaltender would have absolutely wanted back, but it was still a nice reward for a generally solid weekend that Cardwell has had. And then the final player on this line, this is indeed one of the tryout players. And honestly, Henneberry didn't really stick out in any sort of impressive way. Probably the least noticeable player on the ice in terms of forwards for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. And not trying to be mean or anything, but that's kind of, out of 12 forwards, there's got to be one who is least notable, and he was it. When it comes to the fourth line, this was a line that was indeed filled with these tryout / AHL signed players, and all of them had their moments here tonight where they had like a couple of decent plays. Allison, Gagnon, Vincent, all of them stood out in an okay way. Could definitely be players who are decent enough for the Barracuda going into next season, but obviously aren't really factoring into the Sharks' future, and so there isn't really too much to say about them. When it comes to the defense, we had 3 players who played in a second straight game, 3 others who were completely new additions to the lineup. The first of which on this first pairing was, of course, Shakir Mukhamadullin, who a lot of people were indeed impressed with yesterday, and a player who I compared to Brent Burns, and with tonight's game I will absolutely double down on that comparison. They're like almost identical in terms of players, except for Mukhamadullin doesn't have the very nice beard to go with him, probably a bit too young for that at this point, but it just feels like it's eerily similar to watch him and how Brent Burns used to play. Both of them were sort of bigger players, and yet were still rather smooth on their skates. We saw Mukhamadullin put that skating to display a couple of times here tonight. Both of them defend primarily with their stick, though can use the body to do so as well. Some nice poke checks that we saw from Mukhamadullin here tonight, and yet also both of them were susceptible to some really, really bad giveaways as well. There was one that was in the first period, if I'm not mistaken, where Mukhamadullin tries to send a breakout pass up the middle. It is intercepted near the Sharks' blue line and immediately leads to a very good chance on net. One of the few very good chances that the Golden Knights actually got in that first period. So some issues with Mukhamadullin's game that does have to be ironed out. And like I mentioned earlier, coaches look for reliability, in particular from their defensemen. So that could be a bit of an issue for him if he wants to make his NHL debut going into this next season. But the offensive talent is certainly there. When it comes to his defensive partner here tonight was Guriev, who actually earns a second straight game in the lineup, interestingly enough. His partner yesterday was Cagnoni, who kind of overshadowed him a bit, and similar things happened here tonight, but there was a certain level of physicality that Guriev did bring. No surprise there. He was the player who got into a fight yesterday against it was the Los Angeles Kings, if I'm not mistaken, and so that continued to be the case. Guriev defensively as well is certainly not too bad, but I won't say he necessarily impressed me so much that I think he's going to pan out for the San Jose Sharks over the next couple of years. And then the final player who was a repeat was actually Pooley here. He was also overshadowed by his defensive partner yesterday, so perhaps that is the reason why he is being given another game. Gannon Larocque was that player yesterday. Here tonight, I thought Pooley was decent again, but still nothing super impressive, kind of like with Guriev, and so there really isn't too much to say about him. When it comes to his defensive partner, number 61, Jake Furlong, he was a player drafted in the 5th round in 2022, and I thought he had a very strong start to this game. I thought the first 20 to 30 minutes of this one, Furlong really did impress me, but then as the game went on, it felt as though there were more and more plays that were somewhat suspect, a couple of really bad giveaways as well, which generally in the end made it a bit of a neutral game for Furlong, but there does seem to be some sort of raw talent there, maybe not on the offensive side of things, but he does seem to have some decent instincts defensively, so he's definitely a player to watch, especially with how young he is. And then when it comes to the last pairing here tonight for the San Jose Sharks, both also sort of tryout-esque type of players, Canal and Furch, nothing too much to say about them, similar to the 4th line for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. And then when it comes to the goaltender, Magnus Krona actually had a very strong game, was not called upon a lot in the first first couple of periods of this one, but had to make multiple very good saves in the third period. Does end up giving up one goal to ruin the shutout for himself, but still a very impressive performance, and I liked how calm and collected he actually looked in the net, especially in comparison to Romanov, who I did like in terms of his athleticism and his lateral movement, but looked slightly shaky and in terms of his confidence yesterday. Krona, on the other hand, seemed to be more in tune with his sort of zen mode, I guess you could say, and looked more so like an NHL goaltender in a way, if you were to sort of look at him and not sort of consider the circumstances that he's playing in a rookie face-off tournament. So that was definitely nice to see, as he could end up being the Sharks' backup goaltender for sure with the Barracuda this season, likely to Makanyemi, and perhaps even challenging for that starting spot. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action for the third and final game of the Rookie Faceoff tournament on Monday, and we'll see if players like Eklund, like Robbins, like Thrun return to the lineup, and how these players end up finishing things up. Class dismissed.